Hey, it's your pal Mike Shea from the website Sly Flourish and author of the books The Lazy Dungeon Master and Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations. I'm going to be hosting a brand new show on the Don't Split the Podcast network called the DM's Deep Dive. Each month, I'll be talking to a member of the D&D community about a particular topic of the game like encounter design, tools for improvisation, and game pacing. You can subscribe to the show through iTunes, on Twitch, or on YouTube. Join me, and we'll all work together to make our games fantastic.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking about Deathtrap Dungeons with amazing designers Jonathan Green, Dr. Davy Jones, Sersa Victory, and Ross. So let's jump right into our conversation with these designers who are known for their very deadly dungeons, and they've just released an amazing new product called Charon's Crown that you are definitely going to want to check out if you love Deathtrap Dungeons. Here we go. Okay, everybody, now I'm here with three incredible game designers, people I am really excited to talk to about Deathtrap Dungeons. First, let me welcome back to the show Jonathan Green. Jonathan Green, for the people out there who don't know, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Not nearly as much as these other guys, but so I've appeared on this show a couple of times. I've appeared on the Tome Show with Jeff Greiner. I've got a handful of design credits to my name. The most recent thing I've started doing is a brand new podcast for the Tome Show called Performance Check, which is interviewing a bunch of people who do actual plays, talking with theater directors and improv people, getting tips for people to, basically be better players. So that's the most recent thing people might have heard me on.
Yeah, it is an awesome idea for a podcast, and I hear you get some pretty cool guests in the lineup.
Especially episode 2 coming up, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's some cool guys hanging out there. So people should definitely check out Performance Check on the Tome Show Network. It is incredible. Also with us is Sersa Victory. Sersa, who are you, and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
I wrote the original 3 fourth core modules back between 2009 and 2012. Took some time off, and I've come back. I've got a new module with DDE Adventures, Defy Danger, called the Crown of Charon. And I do tournament module writing for Kobold Press. I have one coming up here soon called Necropolis of the Mailed Fist, which you can play at Gen Con 50.
Nice, that's awesome. I am excited to check that out, and working with Kobold Press, that's pretty freaking cool. And doing competition modules is something we're definitely going to get into later, because Deathtrap Dungeons sort of have a history in competition modules. So I'm excited to get your expertise and insight on that. But before we do that, let's introduce our other guests. Dr. Davy Jones is with us. Dr. Davy Jones, who are you, and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
I got my start ripping off Sersa and published some adventures in 4th edition. Now I mostly publish things for Dungeon World. I make adventure modules and some other accessory supplements.
Excellent. Well, I'm super excited to have you here today, as I am excited to have Ross with us. Ross, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, so I run DDE Adventures. We're a real small indie press game publisher, RPG publisher. We have a couple titles under our belt right now. We hold, so far, all of Sersa's line, so all of the old 4th core modules we have up on our line for free on DriveThruRPG. And we just published Crown of Charon, so that's kind of our big jewel right now. And before that, we had a couple other small little games like Crush the Rebellion, which was kind of based on some Powered by the Apocalypse kind of stuff. So we really run the gambit in terms of game design mechanics all over the place, from the more traditional dungeon crawling to the more story-oriented stuff. But the kind of the thread that binds it all together is a dark settings, intense gameplay. And of course, we love our Deathtrap Dungeons.
Yeah, Deathtrap Dungeons are quite excellent, and that is what we're talking about today, Deathtrap Dungeons. So, for those who aren't familiar with the term, a Deathtrap Dungeon is a dungeon that has lots of crazy traps in it. Probably more traps than there are enemy monsters, if you will. Tomb of Horrors is probably the most classic and widely known example. Tomb of Annihilation, that is coming out from Wizards of the Coast soon, sounds like it is going to include at least one enormous Deathtrap dungeon, if not several. They're the kind of place that Indiana Jones likes to go into, where there are tons of things that can pop out and kill you. Classically, these dungeons have been ruthless. Player grinders to kill players. People have mixed opinions on them. I would say a lot of times people either love them or hate them, or love to hate them, as it were. So that is what we are talking about today, because you all have just designed a Deathtrap dungeon. So let's talk a little bit about what to you defines Deathtrap Dungeon, and what are some classic examples? I know I just gave one. Jonathan Green, what about you? What do you think defines Deathtrap Dungeon, and what are some classic examples?
Right, so I'm glad we're starting with me first. As the only one who's not a pro designer at these, I get to take some of the easy points. So a Deathtrap Dungeon, we say dungeon, but really like any sort of it's kind of self-contained area, and it should focus on a few things. Yeah, obviously traps are a big part of it, but there should be a focus on exploration, focus on problem solving, a focus on puzzles. And I think for the good ones, it's always things that test character skill, but also test player skill. It's like you can't just rely on what's on your character sheet and what you roll in the dice. Like, you have to be a good player to figure out these puzzles and to navigate these crazy, extreme, high-risk, high-reward scenarios, usually with very extreme consequences. Tomb of Horrors is the classic example. One of my personal favorites, I guess from old D&D, is White Plume Mountain. I think my overall, absolute favorite Deathtrap dungeon is actually one that Sersa made called Fane of the Heresiarch, and that's one I've lost count of how many times I've run that for groups, and it's just a classic one that I always find myself going back to.
Nice, yeah. I think White Plume Mountain is a great example. Sometimes they're dungeons that make you think how, who, why did this come into being? How was this made? What is the point? What is this thing guarding? And then when you find out what it is, oh man, it's usually worth getting through that Deathtrap dungeon if you survive. Those are some great examples. Sersa, what about you? What defines Deathtrap Dungeon to you, and what are some classic examples?
Yeah, I think a Deathtrap Dungeon, the primary conceit, it's a focus on the players overcoming deadly challenges, which combine monsters, puzzles, and of course traps. It's a dare, right? A Deathtrap Dungeon dares you to play it. And I think maybe its closest cousins would be asymmetric board games, where the DM is playing one player. He's a participant. He or she's a participant in the game that is bound by certain rules and certain principles. And then the players are form another group, and it's competitive, right? It's not necessarily something where you come to the table and you try to tell a really compelling story, which is something I might touch on again later, but rather the players are competing with the GM to win.
So an example of that, an asymmetrical competitive board game, would be like Imperial Assault or Doom, that were both put out by Fantasy Flight Games recently.
Yeah, absolutely, and Descent being kind of another really classic example. As far as Deathtrap Dungeons go, my favorite of the sort of the original AD&D stuff was Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan, which just got a re-release in Yawning Portal. And I think it was kind of an underrated one. But I do want to throw a caveat in, if I may. I think it's really important to point out that while these are definitely classic examples, speaking for myself, I don't necessarily think that they were the most fun or well-designed examples of the genre. And we might come back to it later, and I hate to get us off on a tangent so soon. But I feel like, getting to your point, James, about how people have really mixed feelings about it, I think one of the reasons is that they have an experience with something like Tomb of Horrors, which, was written a very, very long time ago. And, the context for what D&D was like was very different. And people play through it and they just have a miserable experience, and then they sort of project that onto, modules that are released in 2017. And so while, I'll buy anything with a green devil face on it, but I never run that adventure as written, Tomb of Horrors.
Yeah, no, you know what? I think you are absolutely right. That, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this podcast, actually, is because I think people get a bad taste in their mouth because they have a bad experience and they're like, oh, that's not what I want to do. That's not why I play D&D. I'm never doing this again. I never want to give it a shot. And I've had some, certainly early in my career, had some bad experiences, but then I think it really is a frame of mind, what you're saying here, framing yourself up for this sort of player versus DM attitude and then having fun with it can actually be a good thing if you let yourself go there. And you can have a lot of fun running these things too. I think that's the other complaint is people don't feel like they have as much fun running them, but you really, really can if you embrace the evil DM within, Yeah. So, and there's also fun, there's fun to be had rewarding people for really clever play. And I think that's what Deathtrap Dungeons are all about. I'm glad you shouted out Tales of the Yawning Portal because White Plume Mountain and Tomb of Horrors are also in that new revamped 5e versions of this book that has just come out. Davey, what about you? What do you think a Deathtrap Dungeon is, and what are some classic examples?
I think a lot of it these guys have covered already. I definitely agree that if there's like a slider between game and story, Deathtrap Dungeons definitely slide more to game. There's some variability there, but I think that a big part of like why the asymmetry is appealing to people who like Deathtrap Dungeons is the fact that it is more of a game. Like there are winning and losing moves. As Sersa was saying, it's challenging you, and that's why it feels good to do well in a Deathtrap Dungeon. You feel like you as a player have accomplished something as opposed to you have told a good story together, which I'm not knocking either. I think one thing I wanted to mention right off the bat is if somebody doesn't like Deathtrap Dungeons, that's completely fair. Like if somebody doesn't like, asymmetric board games, that's completely fair. It doesn't have to be for everybody. On the flip side, it often is sort of not given a fair shake. People don't, as you say, allow themselves to really get into it, or they're not in the right context for it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Which brings me finally to Ross. Ross, do you have anything to add about what makes a Deathtrap Dungeon a Deathtrap Dungeon?
Actually, so I was just reading this newer game that came out that is kind of popular right now, new RPG, Blades in the Dark. It's gotten a lot of buzz, a lot of press, and there's this one line in there that really resonated with me, and I think applies to Deathtrap Dungeons, and it's play your character as if it was a stolen car. And really that embracing of just going into the game and being a little bit reckless and just throwing yourself into the scenario and not being timid, not being conservative. That kind of style of play is going to go really far in most Deathtrap Dungeons. Like you can't do stupid things. Like Dr. Davy Jones was saying, that there are winning and losing conditions. So if you make a bad move, you're going to suffer for it. But at the same time, if you play timidly and if you just play your game very close to the vest and worry constantly about your character dying, you're just going to be worrying the entire game session, and you're not going to have a lot of fun. You really just got to embrace it and jump into it. And another thing that I wanted to talk about is in terms of good design to Deathtrap Dungeons is, a lot of people in their role-playing game careers, they've run into games and sessions where they have like a quote-unquote trap that they see in the adventure, and they have a bad experience with it because it's a poorly designed trap. For example, one that, if your character is going into a room, it triggers and it does damage to you, or something boring like that. But a true Deathtrap Dungeon that's designed well needs to have a good overall game design, and you need to build it to challenge the players, like John was saying, on a personal level, to challenge the player's skill. And so that brings me to another one of the sayings that I like to toss around. Every trap has bait. When you have a well-designed trap in the Deathtrap Dungeon and it goes off and it kills the player, one, they should be pretty excited about it because it was just awesome. And two, they should feel a level of personal responsibility to that. They should say, oh, I should have gotten that trap. Now that it's gone off, I see what the solution to the puzzle was or whatever it was, and I see it. I should have been smart enough for that. I brought this onto myself, as opposed to the DM pulled an unfair trick out of their sleeve and punished me for no reason. So that's kind of the dividing line there between good and poor design, and what makes Deathtrap Dungeons fun or not.
That's great, because that really is my next question is, how do we make these things fun, right? Like there's good and there's bad. It sounds like you're almost saying when you're designing them, each trap should almost be its own game and make sense within the world so that you get that moment of, I should have seen that. It's almost like a good plot twist if you're equating it to story. The best plot twists don't necessarily come out of nowhere. It's like, oh, the clues were there all along and I never picked up on it. Those are the best kind, as opposed to just being backstabbed by somebody who never dropped a hint that they were evil, right? Similarly with traps, it feels like is what you're saying. What do you think, Davey? What about Deathtrap Dungeons? How do we make them fun?
I mean, I think that Deathtrap Dungeons are kind of inherently fun by themselves, because even people who don't run their dungeons in a death trap style present them as though they were death traps. So it's what I mean is like, it's the classic thing where the DM is like, oh, you've heard of this, horde of the necromancer. Many have entered, none have returned. And then you go in there and it's like, there's some goblins and you just run wild over all of it and there's no real threat of danger. But even in that case, the DM wanted you to get the feeling that, oh, this is very dangerous. Like you brought up at the very beginning, and I think it's a great way to characterize them. They're like Indiana Jones dungeons or temples, and I think that's exactly what they are. And you should get the feeling as you're entering these dungeons that they are dangerous. And like the best way to do that is to actually make them dangerous, actually put some threat in there. And so, yeah, I think there's sort of an inherent fun that comes with Deathtrap Dungeons. I mean, I'm talking to a really biased group here. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, what do you think of that idea, Sersa?
Oh, I think you're spot on. I mean, it has its roots in sort of the mythic underworld, right? I think without getting too in the clouds with it, people in general have always been kind of drawn to this idea of this mythic underworld. And I feel like a good Deathtrap Dungeon embraces that and makes it really clear, not only in the actual written module, but in the marketing materials as well. Deathtrap Dungeons that don't, again, sort of dare players to play it, miss an opportunity to really kind of build up some sort of hype around it and excitement. As far as what makes them fun, and this may seem kind of like a tautology or something, but first go into it with a mindset that you're gonna make it fun. One of the things that I personally struggled with for a long time was a somewhat kind of like myopic focus on creating Deathtrap Dungeons that were like technically good, right? Like, oh, according to design principles, they hit all the checkbox in the design pattern checklist, right? But one of the things that I've really been trying to do lately is design like fun first. Like what's going to create really exciting play experiences. And I think, Ross can probably speak a lot to this as well, because I think a lot about public play or convention play or stuff like Defy Danger, where spectacle is kind of most of the point, right? I got my start running these sorts of dungeons at Tower of Gygax, which was this event back when Gary Gygax passed away in 2008, I believe. They held a memorial event at Gen Con where for 24 hours every single day of the con, you just played this ridiculous meat grinder Deathtrap dungeon where a group of 6 would sit down and then someone would die within 10 minutes. You'd all laugh. It'd be ridiculous. The next person would step in, rinse and repeat until it was time to go home. If you watch the Stream of Annihilation that happened not too long ago, Chris Perkins' game when he did the meat grinder sort of thing, very similar, where you had a group and the spectacle was dying. Mm-hmm. One of the things, I don't want to bogart too much time on this, but one of the things that I'm really trying to think about is what I'm sort of calling death first design. I feel like a lot of Deathtrap Dungeons fall down because they try to present them in a context where they're not appropriate. And what I mean by that is you try to throw them into an ongoing campaign, right, where people have a pretty considerable commitment to their characters, and that the ongoing plot or story can be pretty severely jammed up if somebody gets their head cut off. And, one of the things that I think a good Deathtrap Dungeon does is acknowledge immediately and upfront that you're going to die, and you're going to die a lot, and then you build on top of that. You build challenges on top of that to make death fun, right? Because you don't want to be like, yeah, you were hit by a boulder and that's it. We've all been crushed by boulders. It happens all the time. But if it's something really unusual and spectacular, you got your, the Cobra hands on head, like, man, that was rugged. And to Ross's point, you try to make it where players can learn something or benefit from dying, right? Where it's not just this, you were killed and that's it, and then you just try again with no new knowledge. Death should always reveal something, should always be useful. And then, of course, I think really just being a fan of the players, to quote from Dungeon World, I think, there's this lingering stereotype of, I guess, what's called the Viking helmet GM, right? Where he shows up at the table and just murders everybody. And it's not fun, but he's having a good time. He or she's having a good time. And that's really not what I think a good Deathtrap Dungeon GM is like. They give it hard, but they take it as well. And, you want to linger on fun rewards and achievements. And, you want to play up that role as the evil mastermind, but you also want to celebrate the players and make them feel like they're equal participants. Because otherwise, if it's just, imagine a boot stamping on an elf's face forever, that's not fun for anybody.
Hey everybody, wanted to let you know that this week's show is brought to you by Gamefly. That's right, Gamefly. What are they? They're like an old school Netflix for video games. That's right, they send games to your house, you play them, you beat them, and then you mail them back. It's a monthly subscription service. You can get a free premium 30-day trial when you sign up for Gamefly at gameflyoffer.com/DSPN. That's gameflyoffer.com/DSPN. I know you love games. I know that you don't want to spend a ton of money buying all the latest games, beating them, and never playing them again. So check out Gamefly. Saves you money, lets you sample them all. Jonathan, you're approaching this, it sounds like, a little bit more from a player or GM perspective. You keep harping on the fact that you don't have as many design credits as these guys. Although I will say your design credits are excellent, sir, and you should wear them with pride.
There's things I'm very good at designing at. Deathtrap Dungeons aren't one of them. I've tried a few times, and it's just like, oh no, this isn't working.
Oh, well, this is for you. This podcast is for you. So what do you think makes a fun Deathtrap Dungeon? Or, alternatively, what makes a not fun Deathtrap Dungeon, if you're not sure?
Yeah, so jumping off of what Sersa just said, players should know what they're getting into beforehand. It shouldn't just be one of those like, hey guys, this campaign that we've been playing for the last year, now we're going to go into this place. Y'all died in the first room. Okay, well, campaign over. I think that's a terrible, terrible idea. I've run a lot of Deathtrap Dungeons, and I usually do them as, usually extreme, over-the-top one-shots. And kind of,
going back to, I'm not sure who said it, making it, almost a spectacle. In the Stream of Annihilation, Chris Perkins tearing up character sheets. I think one time I actually saw Sersa make a guy eat his character sheet once after he died. I've seen Ross carry around a giant stamp that says "You died," and every time someone dies, it's just "Ka-dunk," and the person's dead. I've even done a competitive dungeon where there was multiple different groups playing in the same dungeon, and what one group did would affect the other group, and we would send runners back and forth. There's actually one that. This is getting a little bit incestuous, but it was one that Davy wrote that Ross and I were running in Scotland about a year ago, and I remember very distinctly getting to run over to Ross's group and yell that there had been a quadruple telefrag, and then run back to my group, and it's just this, this crazy over the top, and suddenly, listening to one group yell and jeer at the other ones, or, and there was actually points involved, and watching the two groups compete and try to see who was actually going to, win this dungeon, who was going to win at D&D.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is this game? It sounds amazing.
That was
that quadruple telefrag was really good and really highlights some of the things we've been talking about, because John, it was your team that was losing because of that. They lost points because of that, but you were so excited because it was so much fun. Even though it was like, oh, all your players are getting murdered, but everyone was just having a ball.
Yeah, and they still talk about it. It's been about a year at this point, and they still talk about that. And oh, can you believe Amber got us all telefragged at the same time?
Yeah.
And they still give her a hard time a year on. So I think players should know what they're getting into beforehand, so they can embrace the insanity. They can embrace the death. The other thing I would say, Ross mentioned earlier about every good trap should have bait. The reward should be worth the risk. If you're putting in these crazy, over-the-top,
traps, monsters, puzzles, whatever, the rewards for those things should be equally crazy and over the top. I mean, you that bait has to be worthwhile. You don't want to deal with, an orb of annihilation and, this giant, these crazy, half Balor, Tarask, Demi-Lich, whatever insane thing you do. It's like, all right, guys, and you did all that, and now you got a +1 dagger. Good job. I mean, no, that's ridiculous. Don't do that to your players. One thing that we've kind of talked about is old dungeons and new dungeons. I think a decent way to a decent analogy for all this is to look at a lot of the recent Dark Souls games where, death is a big upfront part of that. And kind of in the introduction when they brought those back was like, oh, we're making things Nintendo hard again. And it was kind of harkening back to the old days of, the NES era where, games were designed to be, crushingly difficult because there really wasn't a lot of content and, they had to get that $60 worth of game out of you. And those old games weren't necessarily good. The original Ninja Turtles game where you're trying to get through that stupid dam level, that wasn't good design. It was hard and you died a lot. That doesn't mean it's good design.
Some of it is, though. That's the interesting thing to me.
Some of it is amazing. So it's that weird mix of being able to look at the old stuff and recognizing that it has this reputation. Some of it is worth going back and playing. Some of it was just bad design and just killing people for the sake of killing people. But now when someone goes and picks up a Dark Souls game or Bloodborne or whatever they are, the fact that you're going to die is telegraphed front and center. You're going to play that game and you're going to die. And like a good Deathtrap dungeon, every time you die, you learn something new. Like, oh, that boss has that move. Okay, now I know, so I can go back and I can deal with it again. And it continues, and hopefully every death should be a lesson. So a lot of those kind of same principles we were talking about.
Yeah. And related to that, I think Deathtrap Dungeons as a whole are not afraid to look at other media, such as video games, and see what they're doing well and bring it back into the tabletop arena.
No, I think that's all very true, and creating those memorable moments is huge. And a big part of this, I really do think a big part of this, like any game, is buy-in, right? You're not going to be scared if you're playing a horror-themed game if you don't have the buy-in of wanting to be scared. And so I love that advice about treating your PC like a recently stolen car. I have never heard that before, and love it so much. So thank you, Blades in the Dark, and thank you, Ross, for bringing that to my attention, because that is just a great way to approach these things. We've talked kind of a lot about how to make it fun and how to embrace it and make sure your players aren't sort of poking every square inch of a dungeon with the 10-foot pole. How do we incorporate story, right? Like, let's say I've got a big campaign. I want to drop a Deathtrap dungeon into the middle of it, right? I want it to be part of the story. I know it's going to be like perhaps a season finale where several people die. How do I make story work with these Deathtrap dungeons? And why don't we start with you, Davey?
A huge part of it, I don't think this is specific to Deathtrap Dungeons, but just in general, like previewing ideas that are going to appear in the Deathtrap Dungeon is a big thing. Sersa was talking about, just, for a module, you want to make it a challenge to the players. If you're getting ready to put a Deathtrap Dungeon in an ongoing campaign, you can play that up in the story. You can have NPCs talking about this location. You can have rumors that the PCs are picking up. You want to make this Deathtrap dungeon a part of the world that you're dropping it into, so people know about it, people talk about it. You want the theme of the Deathtrap dungeon to match whatever it is you have going on, I think. A lot of the storytelling that gets done in Deathtrap Dungeons tends to be pretty subtle. It's stuff that you can pick up on if you want to. If you're wanting to push a Deathtrap dungeon into your ongoing campaign, you can really play up those themes a lot more, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of show, not tell. You show the story in subtle ways in the background, but you pretty much never have the opportunity to have any kind of blatant exposition because you often don't have a huge cast of NPCs. You have maybe one or two, but for the most part, you're dealing with physical puzzles, monsters, and things, enemies that don't want to necessarily parlay. You do have some, and they're great, but compared to a lot of games, you're really banking on more subtle and implied storytelling.
Yeah, if I could be a nuisance on this question.
Please be a nuisance on this question.
Yeah. I personally don't think that story is a necessity for D&D or Deathtrap Dungeons. I feel like if a story is emergent, right, as the others pointed out, if it emerges kind of organically from the events or in retrospect, right, you look back on it. But I just want to maybe call out a little bit that I guess for people who maybe want to try Deathtrap Dungeons, either as part of a campaign or not, story is not required. I will say, so one of the things that I was asked to do with my Kobold Press module, so it's written primarily for a convention, a tournament setting, but it's really important that there's some kind of usefulness to GM who may be running it either as a one-shot or as part of a campaign. And so I actually put a sidebar in the module giving a GM some advice on what they can do. And really, I think the big takeaway is that, you know, like I said, a lot of story and plot in D&D and fantasy adventure games sort of depends on the player character surviving, right? Because if all, 4+ fantasy adventurers walk into the dungeon, right, the necromancer's tomb, and none of them return, well, that's kind of the end of the story. And a lot of groups, I don't think, want that, right? And so what you might do is, in addition to maybe dialing down the lethality, take a page out of 13th Age, which has, I think they're called campaign losses. And what that means is, let's say a character is struck by a trap. In the campaign version, it's not lethal, but it has some kind of campaign implication elsewhere. One example is they were struck with this cursed spear, and now they can't enter, the Chapel of Mother Memory or something like that. Like I said, I'm a really big fan when playing campaign games. You can drop the dungeons in, but sort of amortize the danger across kind of the entire campaign of the narrative. Because like I said, I think a lot of GMs who might want to use like Tomb of Horrors as their end cap, that's not really what they want. They want something scary, but they actually don't want all of their players turned into bones. If that makes any sense at all.
Yeah. No, I think you're right? It doesn't necessarily make for a satisfying ending to be like, well, you died because you didn't see a pit trap. Sorry. Yeah. Into a longer story, I guess we should say. Definitely to a fun game. And I should remember that I am talking to some fourth core designers here. And
I was going to say, too, an interesting person in this, so it's already been brought up once, I think, is Chris Perkins. Because he does the ongoing story very well. But if you watch it, I think he clearly has some Deathtrap bones to him. You guys were mentioning the character grinder he did recently. But there's also I was going to bring up as one of my classic quote unquote examples of a Deathtrap dungeon. Did you guys run or read or listen to any runs of Minds of Madness by chance?
Yeah, a little bit.
Remember that one? That was
I definitely did.
During the playtest? Yeah.
It was a comedic Deathtrap dungeon, right?
It was, yeah. And it played on a lot of the tropes. It was definitely having fun with it. But I think it's also just a pretty well-designed Deathtrap dungeon. But the reason I bring up Chris Perkins is that he's said in interviews just that he has no problem killing player characters. And oftentimes in the stuff that he's run in live games or in podcasts and stuff, he'll kill a character because you can always bring him back. I think speaking to Sersa's point with game and story, I mentioned that slider. I think it's totally legit to have a dungeon that is all game or virtually all game. And I think you could run the slider the other way too, where you have a Deathtrap dungeon that's very story laden. It just completely depends on what's your style? What are you and your players looking for?
Mm-hmm. And that can change. I don't think you need to declare. I think a lot of people feel the need to declare my group loves story or my group loves power gaming, and that may be what they like most of the time, But
and the reality is probably you have 4 players who all like different things.
Yes, definitely.
And the reality is you probably have 4 players that all like variety.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Different things, different weeks.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that is very, very true. Ross, we have not heard from you in a while. What do you think about Deathtrap Dungeons and story? What do you think? Is it okay to throw the story away sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely takes a secondary seat to the story. Takes a secondary seat to gameplay because your focus is on the design of it, right? But the story is I feel like it's not necessary, but it's a nice enhancer to it. It's another layer to the design, and it's an important one, just like all the other layers are important. So, like I was saying before about implied story, typically what I'll see in my designs is you have the theme to your Deathtrap dungeon, and you express that theme in all of the different rooms. And you really don't need to do a lot to hint at things because you just need to set up enough information to be a kernel of imagination for your players. So let's say, so here's a classic example. Let's say your theme is that, in the background to this dungeon was built by an artificer lich who, loved this woman and lost her. Well, then you can have statues of this woman that have features, that the players would be able to recognize from the little bit of backstory that you threw to them. And you don't have to call it out as like, oh, this is a statue of that woman. You just like call it out as, you call out you show, you don't tell. Mm-hmm. And those kind of little subtle hints kind of bring the story out. And that kind of thing lets the players fill in their own story for what they think is happening. And it just kind of adds a little juice to it.
I think Ross hit on it with the word theme, and I feel like it's really important to disambiguate between story and theme. While I definitely believe that story is not a necessity, I think theme is crucial, right? I think it's really important that a Deathtrap dungeon be more thematic than rectangular gray rooms with skeletons and spiked pit traps, right? Mm-hmm. And there's two reasons for that. One is that it just makes it more interesting from that kind of narrative standpoint. It kind of gets, helps plant the seeds for that emergent storytelling. And, it also provides a different experience. Like Ross said, players want variety, I think. And like I said, it gets really boring to play the same. Like it's a gray stone room with a skeleton and look out for that boulder. But I think more importantly, though, by having a strong theme, that then pushes you as a GM or a designer to come up with more interesting traps and monsters and challenges. One of the things that I do for the Deathtrap dungeons I snap together is I make kind of like a theme keyword salad, where I just sit and I sort of free associate and just write down as many keywords related to the theme of the dungeon, and just I put them into a bowl, right? Mm-hmm. And I pull them out, and it's especially good when you can sort of mash two themes together that are kind of dissonant. And so it could be like plants plus undead, right? Or like ooze plus army, right? Something where you have two themes that don't necessarily sit together as easily as like undead plus tombs, right?
Right.
But what that does is that sort of helps me come up with sort of more interesting traps and challenges and puzzles, especially because then you can start leveraging the lore. To go back kind of to an earlier point, one of the, and I don't have any particular ones in dungeons in mind, but there's sometimes what I like to call like the checkout line puzzles, where they're not necessarily interesting and they don't necessarily reward interaction with the environment or any kind of like, making a tough choice. It's, I'm going to take this Sudoku puzzle that I got out of this 99-cent book that I saw the checkout line next to the gum, and then I'm just going to like replace the numbers with runes, and that's my puzzle. And at least in my experience, both as a GM and as a player, it's interminably boring. And the same is true with traps. To Ross's earlier point, one of the things that, because I will buy, like if you say this is a Deathtrap dungeon, I will buy it. And so I read a lot of it. And one of the things that is sort of a pet peeve for me are traps where the interaction isn't any more interesting than you move to square D16, make a reflex saving throw, or take 1d8 damage. Mm-hmm. I think that's tremendously uninteresting. And I feel like by having a really strong, vivid, and sort of unusual theme, that helps give you some creative fodder, I guess, to come up with things that are a bit more interesting. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it also prevents the players, moving along, just sweeping along with their 10-foot pole, right? That would be a super boring monster, so don't make it a trap. Crown of Charon. Let's talk about that. This is a product that you all have worked on together?
Not me.
Not you. Okay.
It was written by Sersa, and then me and actually another friend of ours, Brendan Flattery, he did the editing. We kind of just put it together and polished it up and put it out.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's talk about this. What is it? Presumably, it is a Deathtrap dungeon.
Yeah, it's a massive Deathtrap dungeon. It is a timed adventure, like many Deathtrap dungeons are, and in that way, it is competitive. There's points to be won and points and ways to score points, and it is slated for 8 hours long. So that's a tight 8 hours. If you threw away the time limit, it would probably take you more, and you explored everything slowly and in detail, it would probably take you more like 12 to get through that whole thing. It's a sprawling underground complex in the underworld of Hades. There is a temple to Charon, the lord of the underworld, on the river Styx, where the souls of the damned are all taken. And as you know, in Greek legend, the bodies of the dead often have, they're floated down the river Styx, and they have coins placed over their eyes. So amongst the millennia and eons of history, the treasures of countless civilizations have been piled up and are waiting for adventurers to come in and take it. The plot of it is that the adventurers are going into the pyramid to claim the Crown of Charon, which would give them power over life and death. Ooh. And they are placed under a spell to enter into this underworld, and they have only a limited amount of time before they're returned to their mortal bodies. And just like in The Nightmare of Elm Street, if you die in the underworld, you die in real life.
Holy crap. That sounds amazing. So what is this for 5th edition D&D?
Yeah, so we have it out. It was originally written for 13th Age, and then we have a version for in that format and also one in 5th edition.
Excellent. And where can people, since it is sort of a timed competition format, is there anywhere upcoming people can play it? Any conventions, that sort of thing?
Good one. Not that I know of.
Well, you guys should grab some tables at Gen Con and get it going. That would be awesome.
Some of us live in the Midwest and probably should do that.
Looking at you, Jonathan.
One thing I'll add about the module is that it's fantasy, but it's not. One of the things that I did with Crown of Charon is I thought to myself a lot, what is the most ridiculous thing I can do right now with this room? And what ended up happening is I don't really have a term for the genre yet, but I'm just kind of calling it nuclear fantasy, where it's super anachronistic. And at the risk of spoiling, I'm going to try to keep the stuff that's in the publisher preview. One of my favorite monsters from the dungeon, to give you an idea of what you're going to be interacting with. What is it? It's a half aboleth succubus, not succubus, but succubus mummy queen. So she's a succubus mummy. She's half aboleth, but she has double pain saws. They're double chainsaws instead of an arm, and they give you mummy rot if they cut you. And I think in that same room there was a living battery acid cloud kill and some gelatinous displacer pyramids with
gelatinous cubes, pyramids, but also with the power of like a displacer beast.
Yeah, and they had like mechanical diesel piranhas inside, and there's a lot of like anachronistic stuff. Like there's a satellite that you can control. You can find a multiple Demon Forge rocket launcher. So if you're into if you remember the original Quake from 1995 or 6, where it was sort of that mishmash of dark fantasy, but also kind of a gritty industrial, I think you'll definitely find a lot to dig in Crown of Charon. But I like to make that really clear because I think, like I said, most Deathtrap dungeons are straight up traditional dark fantasy. But I think Ross and DDE Adventures did a really great job in the marketing of making it clear up front that this is some pretty wild stuff.
Excellent. Well, this is super duper awesome. Thank you all so much for putting it out. Where can people pick this up if they're interested in picking it up?
Yeah, so we have it available on DriveThruRPG. You just search for Crown of Charon and you'll find it there, or you can search for our publisher page on there, which is DDE Adventures. You can hit us up on, we have links on our webpage, ddeadventures.wordpress.com. And I'm also on Twitter at DDE Adventures.
How about the rest of you? Where can people find you individually? Jonathan, let's begin with you. Where can people find you?
Right, so people can reach out to me on Twitter at Jon_M_Green. If you want to see the one thing I published that's still available on DriveThruRPG, you can search for Edge of the Frontier, which is a Western hack of the Star Wars Edge of the Empire system. Also, the new podcast Performance Check that I'm doing over at the Tome Show. So if you're subscribed to the Tome Show feed, you can find that. And then possibly on Kickstarter this October, I'm waiting for a couple final quotes if you're into board games. So that might be something coming in the pipeline, a game called Necropolis.
Nice. That is awesome. And I want to let you know that I'm going to have you back on soon, Jonathan, because I want to talk about the new Fantasy Flight RPG sort of open storytelling system that's coming out that's based on the Star Wars dice and Star Wars systems. So, yeah, I would love to have you on to talk more about that. And Jonathan does not live in the Midwest. That was a joke. He lives all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And how about you? Where can people find you, Ross?
Either through all the contacts for DD Adventures, or you can also get me on Twitter at CStephenRoss. And you can also see some of my miscellaneous Star Wars gaming nerdery at triumphanddespair.wordpress.com.
That's an awesome blog name. That's great. And how about you, Davey? Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Dungeon Oracle. I have a link to my store there. Like I said, I do mostly Dungeon World stuff right now. I have a free little dungeon called Maze of the Elder Brain, which is some Lovecraftian goodness. I also have, like I said, some accessories there. I have a deck of 100 treasure cards for Dungeon World that you can pick up there as well.
Super, super fun. That sounds awesome. I'm on my way over there right now to pick stuff up. And Sersa, where can people find you?
So on Twitter, I'm at Sersa_Victory. If you hook into koboldpress.com, that's where they'll post announcements and news about my upcoming dungeon, Necropolis of the Mailed Fist. And then there's another one coming up that I can't talk about yet. Coming soon at itch.io/Victory Softworks. That's where I'll be publishing my soon-to-be-released little retro arena shooter, Hecatomb. And then I'm working on a procedurally generated text adventure based in the Fourth Core world called Temple of the Death Kings.
That's excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh man, talk about some cool Deathtrap Dungeon action. Thank you so much to my guests for being on this episode of Tabletop Babble. Can't wait to have them back. You know, Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and a great way for you to support it for free is to go leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Even if you don't have an iTunes account, go make one. It's totally free. It takes 30 seconds. You can help out me and all of your other favorite podcasts because, you know, a lot of podcatcher apps, not just iTunes, use the algorithms in the iTunes ratings to form their lists of like top podcasts and recommend podcasts and stuff like that. So go do that. Check us out. And as an added bonus, if you leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, I will read your rating right here on the air out loud. You can make me say anything you want. This week's 5-star review comes from Joseph A. Moreau. His review is entitled Fantastic RPG Podcast. He says, "Love this podcast. James is a highly skilled podcaster. His interviews are top-notch, informative, and entertaining. This is an overall great podcast for anyone interested in RPGs of any flavor. If James were an assassin for hire, I would hire him to do my laundry. Oh, and to kill somebody. However, I do need to request that you do an episode on Realm Works by Lone Wolf Development. Seriously, I need this like a green hag needs lotion." All right. Well, you know what, Joseph? That sounds awesome. I love the people over at Realmworks. Just for you, we will have them on. I'll see what I can do about that. Thank you so much for your review, sir, and for all your support on Facebook and things like that. Really, really, really appreciate it. Everybody else, come leave us a review. You could be my next best friend. You know, if you do want to support the show financially, the best way to do that is head on over to don'tsplittthepodcastnetwork.com and use the affiliate links for Amazon and DriveThruRPG. They're big banners over on the left-hand side of the site. You can't miss them. Go there, click on them, bookmark the site, and then just shop as you normally would. It doesn't cost you anything extra, throws a little bit of a percentage our way. Everybody makes money, everybody's happy, so go please do that. All right, people, you can find me on Twitter at James Introcaso. You can get updates about everything I'm doing in game design on my website at worldbuilderblog.me. It's so awesome. New fancy design up there. Thank you so much to Ryan Hennessy for doing that because it looks amazing. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Head on over to don'tsplittthepodcastnetwork.com to find a bunch of other great shows like Game O'Clock. You love video games? Check out Game O'Clock. There's no video game podcast out there like it. Each month they tackle a different genre, giving you the history, best, worst, and future of that genre. So go check it out. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Remember, RPGs are like sex.
Party 13, let's suit up for adventure.
They're the only ones that can save the world.
What?
A fantasy world of magic, monsters, and heroes.
Yeah, hello? Where is that voice coming from?
Heroes like Andar Patron, the star of our story.
Yeah, that's me, but what are you talking about?
Oh, sorry. We're in a promo for your podcast. Did nobody tell you?
What?
Your podcast. Have Spellbook Will Travel?
Have Spellbook?
It's a scripted fantasy comedy audio drama based on the creator's experiences playing tabletop games.
To be honest, that sounds pretty boring.
Well, it's hilarious. And heartwarming. And great. Super great.
Whatever you say, buddy.
Have Spellbook Will Travel on the Don't Split the Podcast network. Start the adventure at havespellbook.com or wherever podcasts are available for free.